Thanksgiving, a time for family, gratitude, and warmth. In 2009, the Sitton family in Jupiter, Florida, gathered just like millions of others across the country. The aroma of turkey filled the air, children laughed, and the piano played softly in the background. But that night, as the family joined hands in prayer and celebrated what they thought would be a cherished holiday, one of their own sat quietly, harboring a deadly plan. Paul Michael Merhige wasn't just a guest at the table. He was a man with years of silent anger festering beneath the surface. And as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the joy of Thanksgiving shattered in an instant. Shots rang out, screams pierced the air, and in mere moments the Sitton household went from a picture of love to a scene of horror. 4 lives were lost, including 6-year-old Michaela, who had been singing lullabies moments before. What could drive a man to target his own family? What was hidden behind Paul's calm demeanor that no one saw coming? This is the story of betrayal, tragedy, and a Thanksgiving that became one family's darkest nightmare. The Sitton family's Thanksgiving gathering on November 26, 2009 began like any other. Jim and Muriel Sitton had opened their home in Jupiter, Florida to relatives for a holiday steeped in tradition, one filled with laughter, music, and a sense of togetherness. Among the 16 family members present were Paul Michael Merhige, his twin sisters Carla and Lisa's husband Patrick Knight. For 6-year-old Michaela Sitton, the evening was magical. She spent the night singing sweet melodies for the family, her innocence a beacon of light in the room. But amidst the joyful chaos of a family holiday, one guest sat apart, quietly withdrawn: Paul Michael Merhige. At 35 years old, Paul had lived a life shadowed by struggles with mental health, including obsessive-compulsive disorder and reported long-standing resentment towards family members. Though he had been estranged from many of them, he decided to attend the gathering that night, a decision that would soon turn deadly. Paul arrived carrying a gun in his car, though no one would have imagined he was armed. He participated in the evening's traditions, blending in with the group as they enjoyed their meal, shared stories, and watched football. Hours passed, and nothing seemed out of place. To everyone there, it was a perfect Thanksgiving, a reminder of the bonds that hold families together. But as the evening wound down, Paul slipped away to retrieve his weapon. Without a word, he re-entered the room and opened fire on his own family. The first shot struck his twin sisters, Carla and Lisa, who had grown up with him, shared his childhood, and likely trusted him the most. The chaos erupted in an instant. Family members screamed and scrambled for safety, unable to comprehend what was happening. Paul then turned his gun on his aunt, Raymond Joseph, and finally on little Michaela, who had just been tucked into bed. Her father, Jim Sitton, would later recall the unthinkable heartbreak of hearing the shots that ended his daughter's life in what should have been the safest place in the world, her home. By the time it was over, Paul had killed 4 family members and left Patrick Knight severely injured. In the aftermath, as the smoke cleared, he walked out the door, leaving behind a shattered family and a scene of unspeakable tragedy. He fled into the night, sparking a nationwide manhunt that would grip the nation for weeks. What drove Paul Michael Merhige to commit such a monstrous act? The story of that Thanksgiving night is not just one of loss. It's one of unanswered questions, quiet resentment, and the heartbreaking realization that sometimes the greatest danger comes from those closest to us. The Merhige family had always cherished Thanksgiving. It wasn't just a holiday to them. It was a tradition, a sacred moment of connection. Each year they gathered together, putting aside the distractions of everyday life to celebrate what truly mattered: family. In 2009, the family's Thanksgiving celebration was set to be particularly special. Jim and Muriel Sitton had opened their home in Jupiter, Florida, welcoming the extended family into their warm and loving space. It was the perfect setting for a day filled with joy. Muriel had spent hours preparing the feast, making sure everything was perfect. The aromas of roasted turkey, sweet potatoes, and freshly baked pies wafted through the air. Laughter echoed through the house as children played, and the adults reminisced about past gatherings. The home was alive with the kind of energy that only comes when loved ones come together. One of the brightest stars of the evening was the Sittons' 6-year-old daughter, Michaela. A radiant child with an infectious smile, Michaela loved performing for her family. That evening, she delighted everyone with her angelic voice, singing songs that filled the room with a sense of peace and harmony. Her parents couldn't have been prouder as they watched their daughter bring so much light into their family's lives. Among the relatives gathered that night were Lisa and Patrick Knight, who had even more reason to celebrate. Lisa, one of the twin sisters in the Merhige family, was pregnant with her first child. The family had been overjoyed by the news of her pregnancy, and this Thanksgiving was a moment to honor that joy. Her husband Patrick stayed close by her side, ensuring she felt the love and support of everyone around her. Lisa's twin sister Carla was also present, bringing her warm, caring spirit to the gathering. Carla, a gentle and compassionate soul, had always been a grounding force in the family. She shared a close bond with her sister, and the two were inseparable growing up. Their parents, however, remained at the center of it all, grateful to see their children and grandchildren thriving. But among the familiar faces of joy and celebration that night was another family member, someone who had been noticeably absent from gatherings for years. That person was Paul Michael Merhige, Lisa and Carla's older brother. His presence at the Thanksgiving table was both unexpected and quietly noted. For years, Paul had been on the periphery of family events, estranged from his siblings and parents due to a combination of personal struggles and unresolved tensions. Paul's life had not followed the same trajectory as his siblings. While the others had built families, careers, and stable lives, Paul had faced a series of setbacks that left him isolated and bitter. He had been diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder and chronic depression, conditions that had plagued him for years. His family, though loving and supportive, had struggled to bridge the growing emotional distance between them and Paul. He often blamed others for his misfortunes, harboring resentment that only deepened over time. Despite these challenges, the family had always hoped for reconciliation. In the spirit of Thanksgiving, a holiday meant for forgiveness, gratitude, and second chances, they welcomed Paul into their home that evening. It was a gesture of love, a sign that they still believed in his capacity to reconnect. For most of the evening, it seemed like a step in the right direction. Paul ate alongside the family, shared polite conversation, and even smiled during the playful moments. He joined in as the family gathered around the piano, singing songs and basking in the warmth of the moment. But beneath Paul's calm exterior, something darker was taking shape. What no one could have known, what no one could have even imagined, was that Paul had come to the dinner with a plan. For years, he had carried anger and bitterness, quietly blaming his family for his struggles. And now, in the place where he should have felt the most love, surrounded by those who had opened their arms to him, Paul saw only resentment and an opportunity to act on it. The family, unaware of what lay ahead, continued their evening as they always did, sharing stories, laughing, and making memories. For them, this was just another Thanksgiving to cherish. For Paul, it was the night he had been waiting for, the night his dark thoughts would finally find their outlet. It's hard to imagine that someone could sit at a table filled with love and joy while harboring such destructive intentions. But Paul did just that. He sat among his family, smiling at their jokes and enjoying their company, all the while knowing that this Thanksgiving would end in tragedy. The warmth and unity that defined the Merhige family were about to be torn apart in an instant. November 26, 2009. It was Thanksgiving Day in Jupiter, Florida, and the Sitton family home was alive with the warmth of the holiday. Jim and Muriel Sitton had spent days preparing for this gathering, a celebration meant to bring their family closer together. The smells of roasted turkey, stuffing, and freshly baked pies filled the air, blending with the laughter of loved ones and the hum of conversation. It was the kind of evening that felt timeless, where every smile and every shared story felt like a treasured moment in the making. Gathered inside the home were 16 relatives, spanning generations. The family was diverse yet united in their joy, celebrating a tradition that brought them together every year. Among them was 6-year-old Michaela Sitton, Jim and Muriel's only daughter. Michaela was a vibrant, curious child with a love for music and performing. That evening, as the family settled into the cozy living room after dinner, Michaela's sweet voice filled the space. She sang songs for her relatives, her angelic tone captivating everyone. Her father, Jim, couldn't help but record the moment, smiling proudly as he captured his daughter's innocence and joy. For Jim, this Thanksgiving was everything he had hoped it would be. Among the many faces at the gathering was Paul Michael Merhige, Jim's brother-in-law. Paul was quiet and unassuming, keeping mostly to himself. His presence was surprising to some, as he had been estranged from the family for years. The Sittons had not initially expected him to join the festivities, but Paul had arrived earlier that evening, seemingly eager to reconnect with his relatives. To most of the family, Paul's return was a welcome one, a sign that he was trying to rebuild bridges. But Paul was no ordinary guest that night. He had always been something of an enigma. A man with a complicated past, Paul had struggled for years with personal demons. Diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder and depression, he had lived much of his life in isolation, burdened by feelings of inadequacy and resentment. His relationships with his twin sisters, Lisa and Carla, had been strained, marked by years of unresolved tension. Still, on this Thanksgiving night, Paul appeared to set aside his differences, blending into the familial atmosphere as if nothing were amiss. The evening unfolded like a perfect Thanksgiving should. The family gathered around the dining table, offering prayers of gratitude before digging into the feast. Plates were piled high with turkey, mashed potatoes, and cranberry sauce, and glasses clinked in toasts to health and happiness. Conversations flowed freely, laughter echoed through the home, and for a few precious hours, the world outside seemed to fade away. As the meal concluded, the group moved to the living room, where Michaela's musical talents took center stage. She sat at the piano, her tiny fingers dancing across the keys as she sang lullabies and Christmas songs. The family listened intently, their faces glowing with pride and joy. Her parents beamed, reveling in the love that filled their home. And yet, in the midst of this celebration, Paul remained quiet, his demeanor subdued. He participated just enough to avoid drawing attention to himself, but his mind seemed elsewhere, detached from the laughter and music around him. None of the family members could have known that in the weeks leading up to this holiday, Paul had been meticulously planning something unthinkable. He had purchased several firearms and made significant withdrawals from his bank account. At some point during the evening, Paul quietly excused himself from the gathering. He walked away from the noise and warmth of the living room, slipping into the shadows of the house unnoticed. In his absence, the family continued their celebrations, unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. Paul's departure seemed ordinary enough. Perhaps he needed a moment alone, or perhaps he simply wanted to step outside for some air. When Paul returned, the festive glow of the evening would soon be extinguished. The family, still basking in the joy of togetherness, was completely unaware that the man who had once been a beloved brother, uncle, and cousin was about to shatter their lives forever. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the Sitton home stood as a symbol of love and unity. But within moments, it would become something far darker, a scene of unimaginable tragedy that would haunt this family and their community for years to come. Thanksgiving night, November 26, 2009. The Sitton family home in Jupiter, Florida, was alive with celebration. The laughter of loved ones echoed in the cozy rooms, mingling with the faint melody of hymns sung around the piano. 6-year-old Michaela Sitton, full of energy and joy, had delighted everyone earlier with her sweet voice, singing lullabies and filling the house with the childlike magic only she could bring. The dinner table had been cleared and conversations shifted to family updates and shared memories. A quintessential holiday gathering. It was the kind of evening meant to bring people closer, to heal old wounds and strengthen bonds. Paul Michael Marahig sat among them. He was the cousin and brother that some hadn't seen in months. Estranged from many of his relatives, Paul's arrival that evening had been unexpected. He wasn't originally invited, but his parents had insisted he come. On the surface, he blended in, sitting quietly, offering polite responses when addressed, and staying just out of the limelight. Few would have noticed the tension behind his calm demeanor, the storm brewing in his mind. For most of the family, Paul was simply there, a background figure in a vibrant and happy gathering. But behind that quiet exterior was a man harboring years of resentment and rage, resentment that no one in the room had fully understood. Over the years, Paul had struggled with mental health issues, including depression and obsessive-compulsive disorder. He had alienated himself from many family members, blaming them for his perceived failures and setbacks in life. To Paul, this wasn't just a holiday. It was an opportunity for revenge. As the evening wore on, the family began to wind down. Children played in their pajamas, parents shared quiet moments over coffee, and goodbyes were starting to be exchanged. Paul, however, lingered. He excused himself and stepped out of the living room. No one paid much attention. After all, it wasn't unusual for someone to step away for a moment. But what they didn't know was that Paul had come prepared for something far beyond the realm of comprehension. Hidden in his belongings was a Glock 9mm handgun, purchased weeks earlier as part of a meticulously planned attack. Moments later, Paul returned to the room. This time, he wasn't empty-handed. With chilling composure, he raised the weapon and fired his first shot. His target was his pregnant twin sister, Lisa Knight. The sound of gunfire shattered the air, turning a serene evening into chaos. Lisa, just 33 years old and glowing with the anticipation of motherhood, was struck. Her husband, Patrick Knight, leapt to protect her, throwing himself in harm's way. But Paul's aim was unrelenting. He fired again, wounding Patrick and ensuring Lisa's fate. Panic erupted as the family screamed and scrambled for cover, trying to comprehend the unthinkable reality of what was happening. But Paul wasn't finished. He turned the gun on his other twin sister, Carla Maragige, who had been sitting nearby. Carla, who had often tried to support her brother despite his troubled nature, became his second victim. She had no time to react as Paul fired again, his anger consuming everyone in his path. Raymond Joseph, Paul's 76-year-old aunt, rose from her chair in a desperate attempt to intervene. A kind and nurturing woman, Raymonde had always been a stabilizing force in the family. She pleaded with Paul to stop, her voice trembling with fear and love. But Paul didn't hesitate. He turned the weapon on her and pulled the trigger, silencing her forever. In the chaos, 6-year-old Michaela Sitton clung to her innocence. She had been the light of the evening, her laughter and songs lifting everyone's spirits just hours earlier. But Paul's wrath showed no bounds. He aimed the gun at the little girl. Her parents, Jim and Muriel Sitton, screamed in desperation, begging Paul to spare her. Their cries fell on deaf ears. Paul fired, striking Michaela and ending her life in an act so cold and senseless that it defied understanding. Jim later recounted cradling his daughter's small body, feeling her heartbeat slow until it stopped entirely. The room was a nightmare. Blood stained the floors and walls where laughter had once reigned. Survivors huddled together, trembling and unable to fathom what they had just witnessed. Paul, unfazed, calmly left the house. He got into his car, started the engine, and drove away as though he had simply finished a meal and was heading home. He left behind a family shattered, their lives forever altered. Rudy, the first 911 call came from Jim Sitton. His voice cracked with anguish as he described the massacre. "He shot my daughter. He shot my daughter in the head," he cried. Emergency responders arrived to find a scene that was beyond words. A home meant to be filled with the warmth of Thanksgiving, now cold with grief. As the police began their investigation, it became clear that Paul Maragige had planned this attack down to the smallest detail. He had withdrawn thousands of dollars from his bank account in preparation for his escape. He chose Thanksgiving, knowing the family would be gathered in one place. He had waited patiently through dinner, through conversations, through songs, until the moment he decided to strike. For the Sitton family and the surviving relatives, the events of that night would replay in their minds for years to come. How could someone so close, so trusted, commit such a heinous act? How could they not have seen it coming? These questions would haunt them as they grappled with their loss and the horrifying reality of betrayal from within their own family. And as the clock struck midnight on that Thanksgiving night, the Sitton family's lives would never be the same again. The joyous holiday they once loved had turned into a nightmare that no one could ever forget. The world would soon learn of this unimaginable tragedy, and the search for Paul Michael Maragige had just begun. In the chilling silence that followed the gunshots, the Sitton family home, once filled with laughter, music, and the comforting aromas of a Thanksgiving feast, was left in chaos. Paul Michael Maragige, the man who had been a quiet presence at the table just hours earlier, had turned the holiday celebration into a scene of unimaginable horror. The echoes of gunfire lingered, and the cries of the survivors filled the air as they rushed to comprehend the devastating reality. 4 family members were gone, their lives stolen in an instant. The aftermath was an emotional and physical devastation that rippled far beyond the home. Carla Maragige, Paul's twin sister, was among the victims. Known for her compassion and loving nature, Carla had spent her life trying to support and understand her troubled brother, never suspecting that she would become one of his targets. Lisa Knight, Paul's other twin sister, was killed alongside her unborn child, a mother-to-be who had been joyously looking forward to the arrival of her firstborn. Their aunt, Raymonde Joseph, the family matriarch, was a beacon of strength and wisdom for the Merihij clan. And perhaps most heart-wrenching of all, 6-year-old Michaela Sitton, the youngest victim, who had spent the evening singing Christmas carols, was struck down in a moment of pure innocence. The survivors, though physically unharmed, were left emotionally shattered. Jim and Muriel Sitton, the parents of Michaela, were thrust into a nightmarish reality that no parent should ever face. Jim, a local news cameraman, had invited Paul to the Thanksgiving celebration, extending an olive branch to a man who had become increasingly estranged from the family over the years. Jim believed he was doing the right thing, fostering connection and forgiveness during a holiday meant for love and gratitude. But that decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. As the Sittons and other relatives called 911 and tried to comprehend what had just happened, Paul Michael Merihij slipped into the night. His meticulous planning ensured his escape. He had come prepared with extra clothing, cash, and a plan to disappear. Authorities launched a nationwide manhunt almost immediately. Descriptions of Paul flooded the media. His piercing blue eyes, his receding hairline, and the cold demeanor that had unnerved those around him in the days leading up to the massacre. The tragedy captured the nation's attention, not only because of the brutality of the act, but because of the eerie precision with which it had been executed. In the days following the killings, more details about Paul began to surface. It became clear that this massacre had not been a spur-of-the-moment act. Paul had been planning the attack for weeks. Friends and acquaintances came forward sharing chilling details. Paul had spoken cryptically about wanting to kill his family, but no one believed he would actually act on those words. He had purchased multiple firearms, scoped out the gathering, and chosen Thanksgiving knowing that all his intended targets would be under one roof. It wasn't an act of passion, it was cold, calculated revenge. Months turned into weeks, and with every passing day, the Sitton family and the community of Jupiter, Florida lived in fear. Paul, who had always been reclusive and unpredictable, seemed capable of anything. Billboards and news programs across the country featured his image, urging the public to come forward with any information that might lead to his capture. The Sittons publicly pleaded for justice, their pain and grief visible to a nation transfixed by the tragedy. Then, on January 2, 2010, 8 days after the massacre, a tip led U.S. Marshals to a small, unassuming motel in the Florida Keys. Paul had been living in hiding under an alias, paying for his room in cash and avoiding any contact with the outside world. When authorities surrounded the motel and arrested him, Paul showed no resistance. He appeared eerily calm, offering no remorse or emotion as he was led away in handcuffs. Inside his room, investigators found stacks of cash, a television, and evidence of the carefully planned escape he had orchestrated. He had managed to evade justice for over a month, but now his time was up. For the Sittons and the rest of the Merihij family, Paul's arrest brought a bittersweet sense of relief. The man who had caused so much pain was finally in custody, but the wounds he had inflicted could never be healed. As the trial approached, the family braced themselves for what they knew would be an emotional ordeal. However, Paul surprised everyone by pleading guilty to all charges in October 2011, sparing the family a drawn-out trial. In court, he showed little emotion, even as the names and lives of his victims were recounted in harrowing detail. Paul was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, a punishment that ensured he would never harm another soul. But for the Sitton family, justice was not the same as closure. In the years since the massacre, Jim and Muriel have worked tirelessly to honor Michaela's memory. They established a scholarship fund in her name focusing on the arts, a fitting tribute to the little girl who loved to sing and play the piano. The family has spoken openly about their grief and the importance of recognizing and addressing mental health issues, hoping to prevent another tragedy like theirs. Every Thanksgiving, as families across the country gather to celebrate, the Sittons are reminded of the night that changed their lives forever. It's a day marked not by joy, but by reflection, a painful reminder of what they lost and the enduring strength it has taken to move forward. For the community of Jupiter, Florida, the tragedy remains a stark example of how the unthinkable can happen. Even Paul Michael Merihij may spend the rest of his days behind bars, but the pain and questions he left behind will never fade. Why did he harbor such hatred? Could it have been prevented? And how does a family rebuild when so much has been taken from them? These are the haunting echoes of a massacre that will forever be remembered as one family's darkest Thanksgiving. For the Sitton family, November 26, 2009 wasn't just another holiday. It was supposed to be a memory they would cherish forever. Thanksgiving had always been a time for family, for love, and for tradition. But in a single night, all of that was stripped away, leaving scars that would never heal. What happened that evening didn't just claim 4 lives. It shattered the very foundation of a family and left an entire community grappling with the weight of an unthinkable tragedy. Jim and Muriel Sitton, the hosts of the Thanksgiving gathering, lost their only child that night. 6-year-old Michaela, their light, their joy, was gone. Just hours before, Michaela had been singing songs for her family, a picture of innocence and happiness. Jim, a seasoned news cameraman, had captured countless tragic stories during his career. But this time, the lens turned on his own life, and he was forced to relive the devastation in ways he could never have imagined. Michaela's room, her toys, her laughter, everything she had touched became haunting reminders of what was stolen from them. Jim later recounted how the night should have ended with goodbyes and hugs, with the warmth of family lingering in their home. Instead, it ended with screams, gunfire, and chaos. For months after, he and Muriel would wake up in the middle of the night, their minds replaying the horrific scene over and over. The loss of Michaela wasn't just the loss of a child. It was the loss of their dreams, their future, and the person they had loved most in the world. The ripple effects didn't stop with the Sittons. Patrick Knight, Lisa's husband, bore the physical and emotional scars of the massacre. Patrick had been critically injured as he tried to shield others from Paul Murridge's rampage. He spent weeks in a hospital bed, enduring surgeries and physical therapy. But the real battle was the grief that followed him long after the physical wounds began to heal. His wife, Lisa, had been 5 months pregnant, their future as a family full of hope and excitement. But Paul's actions didn't just take Lisa's life. They erased Patrick's vision of the life they were building together. For Carla Merhige, Paul's other twin sister, the tragedy cut deeper than anyone could fathom. She had spent much of her life trying to connect with Paul, trying to be the sister he needed. That Thanksgiving was supposed to be a chance to rebuild those bridges. Instead, she became one of his victims, silenced by the very person she had tried to save. And then there was Raymond Joseph, Paul's aunt, a woman described as kind-hearted and full of life. Her family was everything to her, and she had always made it a priority to bring people together. That night, she became another casualty of Paul's rage, leaving behind loved ones who would never understand why such a beautiful soul had to be taken in such a brutal way. The town of Jupiter, Florida, was rocked by the tragedy. In a close-knit community where neighbors often looked out for one another, the news of a family massacre was both horrifying and deeply personal. Vigils were held for the victims, candles flickering in the night as hundreds gathered to mourn and support the survivors. Local churches opened their doors, offering solace and a space to grieve. For weeks, the names of the victims were spoken in whispers, their stories retold in classrooms, coffee shops, and homes. But with the shock came questions. Hard, painful questions that no one wanted to ask, but everyone needed answers to. How could this have happened? How did a man like Paul Michael Murridge, with a documented history of mental illness and violent tendencies, go unnoticed until it was too late? Family members later revealed that they had reservations about inviting Paul to the gathering. Some had even voiced concerns about his unpredictable behavior, but those warnings were dismissed. After all, it was Thanksgiving. It was a time for forgiveness, for family, for second chances. No one could have imagined the consequences of that decision. The tragedy also brought attention to broader societal issues, particularly the stigma surrounding mental health. Paul's struggles with obsessive-compulsive disorder and depression were well documented, but they were treated as personal failings rather than signs of a deeper, unresolved issue. His relatives had seen glimpses of his anger before, disputes over money, simmering resentment, and a history of estrangement. But like so many families, they had brushed it aside, hoping time would heal wounds that were never truly addressed. For the Sitton family, turning their grief into action became a way to survive. Jim and Muriel established the Michaela Joy Sitton Foundation in honor of their daughter, focusing on celebrating her love of music and the arts while supporting families affected by tragedy. They poured their energy into keeping Michaela's memory alive, speaking openly about their loss in interviews and at community events. Jim, a man who had spent decades telling other people's stories, found himself at the center of his own, one he never wanted to tell. The legacy of the 2009 Thanksgiving massacre continues to be felt, not just by the victims' families, but by the entire Jupiter community. It's a haunting reminder of how quickly life can change and the importance of addressing the cracks that often go unnoticed in our loved ones. For the Sittons, the holiday season will forever be marked by the absence of laughter, by the memories of what was, and by the questions of what could have been. But through their pain, they've found a way to honor those lost, ensuring that their lives, however short, continue to make an impact on the world. As the echoes of gunfire faded, the full weight of what had just happened began to set in. 4 members of the Merihij and Sitton families were gone. A day meant to be filled with love, gratitude, and togetherness was now etched into memory as a nightmare of unimaginable proportions. And yet, as the survivors grappled with their loss, the question lingered. Why? What led Paul Michael Merihij, a man they called family, to carry out such a calculated and cold-blooded attack? To understand the unthinkable, we must dig deeper into his past, his relationships, and the broader issues that this tragedy exposes. For years, Paul Merihij had been a man struggling with inner demons. Described by some who knew him as reclusive, Paul lived with severe mental health challenges, including obsessive-compulsive disorder and depression. He had spent much of his adult life in isolation, withdrawing from both social connections and family. While his struggles weren't a secret, they were never fully confronted. The Merihij family, like so many others, seemed unsure of how to handle a relative with such profound emotional difficulties. Conversations about his behavior were likely had behind closed doors, but no meaningful steps were taken to address the warning signs. Signs that, in hindsight, seemed glaringly obvious. What's chilling about this case is the level of premeditation involved. Paul didn't arrive at the Thanksgiving gathering on a whim. He knew he wasn't invited, but he chose to show up anyway. In the weeks leading up to the massacre, he legally purchased firearms, including the Glock handgun he would use to commit the murders. He had ample time to reconsider, to turn back, to seek help. Instead, Paul joined the family, sat at their table, ate their food, and participated in their joy, all while harboring the deadly intent that he would soon carry out. This duality, his ability to mask his rage while outwardly participating in the holiday festivities, is one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. It raises an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes those closest to us can conceal the most dangerous parts of themselves. For hours, Paul appeared calm, even friendly, as he sat among his relatives. He laughed, he listened, and he even sang along with little Michaela Sitton as she performed her favorite songs on the piano. But underneath, there was no joy, only a simmering, quiet hatred that would soon erupt. In the aftermath, survivors and investigators alike were left to piece together the motives behind Paul's actions. His history reveals a man consumed by resentment. Paul had reportedly felt overshadowed by his twin sisters, Lisa Knight and Carla Merihij, whom he viewed as more successful and more beloved by their family. He had also carried grudges against his aunt, Raymond Joseph, and others present at the gathering. These feelings of inadequacy and jealousy had festered for years, unchecked and unspoken. And on that Thanksgiving night, Paul decided to settle his perceived scores in the most brutal way imaginable. This tragedy forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of family dynamics. The Merihij family likely believed they were doing the right thing by tolerating Paul's eccentricities, by trying to include him despite his isolation, and by avoiding direct confrontation over his behavior. But was this silence their undoing? Could open dialogue, intervention, or even a stronger stance against his attendance that evening have prevented the massacre? It's a haunting question with no easy answer. The massacre also shines a harsh light on the stigma surrounding mental health. Paul's erratic behavior and long-standing issues were well known, yet there was a reluctance to address them head-on. Why? Perhaps because mental health struggles often remain shrouded in shame, even within families. It's easier to avoid, to sweep things under the rug, to hope the problem resolves itself. But for the survivors, the weight of this tragedy is immeasurable. Jim Sitton, who lost his 6-year-old daughter, Michaela, has spoken publicly about the profound grief that still lingers. Michaela was the light of the family, a little girl with a passion for music and a heart full of kindness. She had spent the evening performing songs for her relatives, filling the house with the innocence of childhood. Her loss is a reminder of how fragile life can be and how deeply violence reverberates through the lives of those left behind. In the years since, the Sittons and others have tried to channel their grief into something meaningful. They've advocated for mental health awareness and have worked to honor the memory of their loved ones, particularly Michaela. But no amount of advocacy, no foundation, no public outreach can ever truly fill the void left by that Thanksgiving night. And then there's the broader societal reflection. The Thanksgiving family massacre forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that tragedies like this don't exist in a vacuum. They are often the result of a perfect storm: untreated mental illness, ignored warning signs, and a lack of communication within families. What can be done to prevent another tragedy like this? It starts with acknowledging the importance of mental health, both in seeking help for ourselves and in supporting those who may be struggling around us. It's about breaking the silence and fostering conversations, no matter how uncomfortable they may be. Finally, there's the lesson of vigilance. While it's impossible to predict every act of violence, the signs were there. Paul's family had heard his threats before. They knew about his struggles. They had even debated whether to include him in the Thanksgiving gathering at all. These red flags, in hindsight, were undeniable, and yet they were dismissed, out of hope, out of love, or perhaps out of fear of confronting a harsh reality. The Thanksgiving family massacre will forever be a haunting reminder of what happens when pain and resentment go unaddressed, when the cries for help are misunderstood or ignored, and when silence takes the place of action. As we reflect on this tragedy, the challenge lies in ensuring that no other family has to endure the same pain, and in remembering that even in the closest of circles, there can be shadows we may never fully understand. As the dust settled on that fateful Thanksgiving night in 2009, the lives of the Sitton family and the broader community were forever changed. Paul Michael Murhaga's actions left a trail of unimaginable grief: a child full of promise silenced, twin sisters and a beloved aunt taken too soon, and survivors haunted by memories that could never be erased. The manhunt that followed was relentless, with authorities searching for weeks until Paul was finally found hiding in a Florida Keys motel. Justice was served with 7 consecutive life sentences, but no sentence could repair the wounds inflicted that night. For the Sittons, each passing year is a reminder of what they've lost, and a testament to their resilience as they strive to honor the memories of Lisa, Carla, Raymonde, and little Michaela. This story isn't just about a crime, it's about the cracks that can exist beneath the surface, the warning signs that go unheeded, and the profound impact of unchecked anger and resentment. It's a story that forces us to ask, could something have been done to prevent this tragedy? What do you think? Could this devastating event have been foreseen or stopped? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, please hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications to join us for more true crime stories that explore the darkest corners of humanity and the light we strive to find within it.